Good morning. Good to see everybody again this morning. I didn't hear a bell, but I think it's 9 a.m. and I see the back doors closing. So I think that it is time. Again, good to see everyone. We are going to be going through the epistles of Peter this quarter. I'm glad that you all joined us here. So all of our adult classes are covering Peter this quarter. And so if you want more of a lecture-oriented class, this is a place for you. Auditorium. I love discussion, but the auditorium isn't the most conducive place for that. But always any comments and discussion is welcome in here. If you really want some heavy discussion, 402 is a great place to go. And so Parker and Myron will be in there this quarter. And so if you want to check that out, I promise I won't get my feelings hurt. So before we begin today, let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for giving us today, and we thank you for all the blessings that you bestow upon us. And Lord, just help us to use the things that you give to us in a way that glorifies you, and just help us to try to advance your kingdom in everything that we do, and so that we can help to be a light in this world. Lord, we have many sick and many needy of our number, and just please bless them and give them strength through their trials. And as the church, just help us to be an aid and encouragement to those who have those kinds of needs, and just help us to be vigilant to look for people who have those needs, and just help us to constantly have care and concern for our fellow people in this world. Lord, please continue to watch over our spiritual leaders and just help them to continue to make sound decisions that are in accordance with your will, and just help us as the flock to make that job as easy as possible for them. It's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. All right, so the epistles of Peter. And the word epistle is something we probably only use in church, but it's just a fancy way of saying that it's a letter. The word is epistole in Greek, and so we just transliterate it into epistle, and it just means to send something upon an individual. So it's a letter, and as any letter, it's helpful for us to have some context that's behind that letter. It helps us to understand who's writing, who's being written to, the relationship between those people, the context, the reason in which that letter is being written. I know I've used this example before, so it's okay. But the thing I always think of is like the difference between, say, a 5-year-old writing to his grandparents and saying how he loves them and misses them and can't wait to see them again. That 5-year-old in their mind might be thinking, they really genuinely want to see those grandparents again, and that they can, have fun and play games, maybe get some chocolate chip cookies or something. And that's the context there. But you have perhaps that same letter written by a college-age person writing to his grandparents. I love you and can't wait to see you again. There might be a little bit of an ulterior motive there. That college student, nothing against college students, but that person may hope to get a little bit of an advance on on some money and a little bit of a gift from their grandparents, and they might have a little bit of spending money. And so those words may have a little bit of an additional meaning there. My point in saying all of this is that context is king. And so we need to be keenly aware of the context of any letter that we're writing. And so today, for most of this, and perhaps even all of the period today, we'll be discussing the environment of this letter from Peter. So first, we'll talk about the author of the letter. And the name should probably give us a clue, right? Even the first verse will give us a clue. And so verse 1:1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. And so this is Peter writing this letter. And so who is this Peter? And this is a painting made in the 1600s by a guy named Rubens. I love the expression on there. It looks like he's 13 and he's been just asked to take out the garbage, like he's rolling his eyes or something. But yeah, so who is Peter? And so first, he is a Jewish fisherman out of Capernaum. Capernaum is a town. You guys have been in Luke here previously, and so Capernaum is a town that's on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, and so he's a Jewish fisherman. He's a Galilean. He's out of Capernaum. So Luke 4:31 and 38, and he went down, and Jesus went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath. And so when he was in the synagogue. So he's teaching Jewish people. Verse 38, and he arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. And so Simon Peter, we usually call him Peter, but he was born Simon. Other ways of saying that is like Shimon or Simeon. Both of those are the same name, just different ways of transliterating it. It's a very common name for Jewish people of that era. And it means one who hears in Hebrew. You'll see his name also referred to as Peter or Cephas, and that means rock in Greek and Aramaic. So Peter and Cephas means the same thing. Just Peter, Petros, means rock in Greek. Cephas means rock in Aramaic. And we'll see why he has these other names here in just a minute. So he's this Jewish fisherman out of Capernaum. Jesus enters Simon's house. So there's this relationship there. Chapter 5, 1 through 3. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him, Jesus, to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, Sea of Galilee, same thing. And he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, those boats of the fishermen, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. So Simon, Peter, he is a fisherman by trade. Now we kind of think of the kind of person who is a fisherman, and then the kind of person who is going to write, one of the very few, books of the Bible. Typically a person who's going to write any kind of a religious treatise or be a religious leader, you don't really think of them as starting out their life as a fisherman. So a very unlikely path for this man, Peter. But that's the path that he took. And I think that's one thing we need to realize. It's kind of an undercurrent of the New Testament that it's being written by a very unlikely group of people. And so, the Jewish people of that time wouldn't have thought of Peter as this fountain of wisdom and knowledge, this person who was this fisherman. But that's, one of the leaders of our church. And so that should be something that speaks to us, that any one of us can serve in a very important capacity. More about Peter. So he is a son of a man named Jonah from Matthew 16. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So Simon Bar-Jonah, that bar means son of in Hebrew and Aramaic. And so, and then John 1:42, he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John." John and Jonah are, again, the same name, just different ways of transliterating it into Greek. So he's the son of a man named Jonah. He is a brother. And so in Luke 6, Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James and John and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas. It's hard for me not to sing this part. And James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. But we have Peter and Andrew, his brother. So Peter has a brother. His brother was Andrew, and Andrew was a fellow apostle. So he's also a husband, which is a very big thing, especially with what some people in different groups believe about Peter and the qualifications of being someone like Peter. But Peter was a husband. He had a wife. And Luke 4, so back to Luke again. "And he arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house." We just read that. "Now Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever, and they appealed to him on her behalf." So Simon had a mother-in-law. So you can't exactly have a mother-in-law if you don't have a wife. I mean, it's just kind of a thing of physics there. And so he has a wife. But one might say, well, maybe Simon is like a widower or something. But we have also Paul writing in 1 Corinthians, "This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas?" And so Peter had a wife that he was with, and that wife came along with him on some of the things that he did. And so he is a husband. So that's something to keep in mind about Peter. And I think that's something to keep in mind about the qualifications of spiritual leadership that other groups might put. There are groups that would say you can't be married and be some kind of spiritual leader. Well, Peter was married. He was a married man. Okay? He was a disciple and an apostle. Luke 6, "In these days he went out to the mountain and prayed, he being Jesus, and all night he continued in prayer to God, and when day came he called his disciples and chose from them 12 whom he named apostles. And then we get back into what we had read a second ago. And Simon Peter is one of those people. So Peter was a disciple. He was a follower of Jesus. And then he was named one of the 12 apostles. And so all the idea of what an apostle is, we talked about that word epistole before being a letter. Well, we'll take another word, apostolos, which comes from that same root. It's just different prefix. So apa on the prefix instead of epi on the prefix. And so if epistole means to send something upon, like a letter, and apostolos is something that's sent away. And it comes from that verb apostello, to send away. And that's what makes these men apostles. Not that they're important, not that they sit on some kind of high, lofty throne, but that Jesus sent them away. He sent them on a mission. And so their responsibility is their defining factor. That word apostello is also used in other secular Greek texts as like an emissary, an ambassador, that kind of thing. And so think of, again, the function of an emissary and an ambassador, and then the function that the apostles, the 12 apostles, played for Christianity. And so we also have Peter addressing himself as an apostle in 1 Peter 1:1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So he is a disciple and an apostle. So he has a sense of leadership, though. He was not a prince of the apostles, but yet he was definitely a spiritual leader within the church. And so that's going to carry some weight when he writes a letter to other people. He was called Peter and Cephas. So in John 1:42, he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. And so this is a direct quote here, that tells us 100% for sure that Cephas in Aramaic means the same thing as Petros in Greek. And both of them mean rock. And so that also tells us that when they were speaking to one another, they were speaking in Aramaic, which is kind of interesting. Matthew 16, and Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So again, he's saying, I'm calling you Peter. And he's calling him Peter because Peter acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God. And so it's sort of like almost a nickname in a way. Almost like Paul became a nickname for Paul. I think I'd rather be called Rock than what Paul was called, because Paulos in Greek means little. And so, that's what Paul was called. And so Peter was called Rock, Paul was called Little, both in Greek. So, but he's called that because of the truth that he revealed here and that he spoke to Christ. So he is called Peter and Cephas. So when you see Simon, when you see Peter, when you see Cephas, that means all the same thing. That's all the same person. So he was born Simon, later called Peter or Cephas. He's an eager disciple. And there's a lot of instances in the Gospels record that, Peter is just this eager person. He's, literally wanting to jump in with both feet. And so he wants, to do as much as he can. And he just wants to, he's really zealous in that regard. So Matthew 14, and this is when Jesus is walking on water. And think of that situation, that it was not just this calm, perfect, peaceful night, but it was stormy. It had blown the boat away from the shore. And so that's the scenario. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus came to them walking on the sea. And it's this windy, kind of stormy night. And Peter answered to him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And so as Peter walks on that water, think of that level of trust, that Peter must have had in order to do that. And so he was a very eager disciple. John 13, Peter said to him, when Jesus is washing everyone's feet, Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." So Peter is, taking this zealous approach that, no, I'm just the disciple, and you are the Lord. You shouldn't wash my feet. He wants to take that level of respect and place within within the kingdom. And so Jesus answered him and said, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." And so Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And so Peter goes from one extreme to the other in his eagerness to serve Jesus. You're too good to wash me. And then when Jesus says, well, you have to do this, he says, okay, from head to toe, basically. And so if you're going to do this, not just my feet, I want to have the entire experience. And so he's this extremely eager person. And that's also in Gethsemane as well. If we go to John 18, then Simon Peter having a sword. And so this is when Judas brings the large group of people to Jesus in order to arrest him. And so you have all of these people, and then just Jesus and his 12 apostles and a few other people minus Judas Iscariot. And so they're vastly outnumbered. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? And so in the face of this vast, overwhelming odds, all of these people coming in to arrest Jesus, Peter, draws his sword almost like this last stand that he is going to fight and perhaps even die in order to defend Jesus. He's willing to do that. And it's kind of interesting then, though, we go just a little bit farther from that. He was willing to fight and die and take that stand, but literally just within an hour or so after that, John 18, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, are you not one of this man's disciples? Are you? He said, I am not. So Peter is also a denier of Christ whenever the chips were down. And then continuing on after that, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They said to him, you are also not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I'm not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. So I find that such an interesting kind of contrast there. On one hand, you have Peter willing to brandish that sword and go down swinging, basically. But then just an hour later, Peter denies Christ, and he's almost like he's embarrassed to be, numbered one of those. And I think it's a fascinating look at the challenges that people, including ourselves, can face when we try to follow God. That sometimes people are eager that they are willing to die for a cause, but yet it's a more challenging thing sometimes to live for that cause. That we can make a huge sacrifice for something, but yet whenever it's a little bit more of a gray area, we're willing to make a spiritual compromise. And so when the chips were down, Peter did deny Christ. He asked for forgiveness. He received forgiveness. And so he was able to make amends for that. But yet he had challenges. And so he's not this, perfect person. And so he is a human being like the rest of us. And we'll see some more of that in a second. He is the speaker on Pentecost. And so just literally, a little over 50 days later, he is the primary speaker at Pentecost. And so Acts 2:14, but Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed the men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem. Let this be known to you and give ear to my words. And so he goes from that point of denying Jesus, and then he is literally the principal speaker on Pentecost. And so he sought forgiveness, he made amends, and he continued in that faith. But he does have a leadership position. I wouldn't say that he is the leader of the apostles, but yet he does have some leadership role within the church when it starts. He's also a leader in Jerusalem, Acts 15. The apostles and the elders who were gathered together to consider this matter. And this was the matter, and we'll talk about this a little more later, but this was an early matter of imposing Jewish law on Gentile believers. And after there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And so again, Peter has this, leadership role. He's, part of that council. He speaks during that council meeting. And so his words do carry some weight, and his opinion on a spiritual matter does carry some weight. But even then, he is a normal person. And so Galatians, this is Paul talking in Galatians. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. And so you have Peter. Even after everything we just talked about, Peter's showing favorites within the church. He made a mistake. And so whenever Jewish Christians came by, he would only kind of eat with them and kind of forsake the Gentile Christians. And he played favorites within the church, and he needed to be corrected on that. And so his decision-making was not absolutely 100% ironclad perfect. He made mistakes just as any of us do. Okay? So he is a human being just like any one of us. I think the big thing we get from this is that he is a leader within that early church. Any thoughts before we continue on to our audience? Yes?
He also took the gospel to the Gentiles first.
Good point. He took the gospel to the Gentiles first. You're right.
He was dedicated to that in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Because he did it on Pentecost, and then later on in Acts, Jesus talked to him and sent Cornelius to him, and he went to their household and baptized them. That was kind of a promise he got to do, was to the Jews and to the Gentiles first.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. And so he definitely broke the ice, so to speak, in order to deliver that gospel to the Gentiles. And that's going to be a big thing for this letter even. I think that's a great point. It's a great point. Any other thoughts before we continue on? Okay. So let's talk about our audience a little bit. So who is Peter writing to? Well, first we have in 1 Peter 1:1, we have to those who are elect. And so we have individuals who are elect. Or the word here is eklektos. If you've ever heard the English word eclectic, that means something that's picked, that's chosen. And so the people that Peter are writing to, the people that Peter are writing to is they're chosen individuals. And so Peter is writing to Christians. He's not writing to people convincing them of the gospel. He's writing to people that are already convinced. They might have some challenges. They might have some doubts. They might need some encouragement. But these are people who are already members of the church. They are already believers. They are part of the elect. Okay? And then further in that same verse, to those in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And so where are those places? They don't really, mean as much to us as saying like, maybe Texas, Arkansas, Kansas, and I don't know, Alaska or something. So where are these places? And so this is a map of that area. And this is modern day Turkey. And so on the south there, that is the Mediterranean Sea. On the north, that is the Black Sea. And so the west side of that we're probably more familiar with. That's the province of Asia, which is one of those. And then the rest of it is just in that same area. To the east, you have Galatia. But Paul, I'm going to say Paul a lot, I know, because my mind is usually on Paul. Peter writes it in the order Pontus, Galatia. Notice how he kind of goes north to south. And then Cappadocia to the east, Asia to the west. So it's like he's talking to all of these people within this whole region, almost showing how much Christianity has spread in this area. So Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. This map is slightly inaccurate because Lycia and Pamphylia on the south, that hadn't become a Roman province yet. It was part of Galatia at that time. It didn't become a province until 74. And this is written earlier than that. But you can kind of see that this isn't a letter from one guy to one specific congregation. This is from one guy to a whole region of people. And so this letter isn't as personal as other letters are. We have letters in the New Testament that are written to individual churches. We have some letters in the New Testament written to individual people. But this is one of those letters that is written to a very wide range of people. Many regions, many people. Not a single congregation or even a few closely related congregations. And so these people would have considered themselves very different from one another, who would have had very different traditions from one another. But even still, it's a primarily Gentile audience. There would have been some Jews here, but most of these people would be Gentile people. And so we need to keep that in mind when we're reading these words. Okay? So that's the regions. And then to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion, still in verse 1. ESV calls them exiles, and other translations, and I kind of like this translation better, is that they are sojourners. And this word here is only used 3 times in the New Testament, twice in 1 Peter and once in Hebrews. And so the idea of this word is somebody who's just passing through, the idea of a sojourner. And it's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament a few times, talking about people of the household and people passing through. And so think of someone who's not a member of this country. They're from another country, but they're passing through this country. So kind of think of the Jewish people when they were trying to make it to the promised land, and they had left Egypt. They were just sojourning in that land when they were trying to find their promised land that was given to them. They were just passing through. So it's a very Jewish way of referring to these people. And then they are the sojourners of the dispersion. And the word here for dispersion is a Greek word diaspora. We would say diaspora, though. That's something that we use. And we actually even use it of the Jewish people. And that word diaspora, it means like scattered like seeds, like the word spora at the end, and like spore in English. It means think of like a sower just casting seeds into the field and throwing those seeds, and the wind is going to carry those seeds wherever they go. And so think of people being cast about like that. People who have been displaced from their homes and their homeland and just cast into the winds and being deposited in other places and other countries. And so Peter is referring to these people by that. But yet most of these people that he's being written to are in their homeland. They're in their home place. But yet this word is often used to describe those of Israel who have been scattered outside of Israel. And so, whenever different groups took over Israel and they took the nation of Israel captive, and they basically took them to their homeland, those people were called of the diaspora. And so these Gentile believers are being described using these very Jewish terms. And in a sense, as Christians, we are this diaspora. We are these exiles, these sojourners. This physical world is not our homeland, but yet we try to navigate our way through this homeland, this land, in order to make it to our home in heaven. And so this isn't our permanent abode around us. We are just visitors in this world, or at least that's the way we should kind of feel about it. We shouldn't be overly attached to this physical life that we have. And so these Gentile believers are being described using these very Jewish terms, and that's going to be a very important component of this. Any thoughts, questions, comments before we move on to another topic out here? Okay. Time and place. So when was this written? And so at the end of this letter, Peter says, "She who is in Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings." And so these people who are likewise chosen, they're chosen together. Peter's writing to a chosen group of people, and he is sending greetings at the end of this letter, others who are likewise chosen. And so there is another group of Christians. So Peter is with another church at this time, and this group is in Babylon. And so as the audience is being described as using Jewish terms, the location of the writing is also being framed in a Jewish way. And so as we just talked about with the diaspora, opposing forces going in and kidnapping people of Israel and basically taking them away and putting them in other lands, Babylon is one of those captors of Israel. And so creating that diaspora, in fact. And so Rome is the captor of God's people in the Christian age. And so Rome kind of stands in for that at that point. And so Babylon here stands for Rome. And so Peter is writing from Rome because it says, she who is at Babylon sends you greetings. And so Peter is writing this letter, and the people that he's with are sending greetings to this audience. And so Peter's writing from Rome. And tradition tells us that Peter dies in Rome in the mid to late 60s AD. And so Peter's probably writing near the end of his life when he is in Rome. Now, given some of the topics of what Peter mentions in this letter and some of the things, more importantly, that he does not mention in this letter, it's probably that he's writing around 64 AD, because Christian persecution was very heavy by Nero after the Great Fire of Rome. And that Great Fire happened in July of AD 64. And after that point, that's when Rome really turned on the screws on the Christian people. And so really began heavy persecution. And so Peter doesn't really mention a lot of that. He mentions the idea of persecution, but not at the heaviness of what it was occurring after that. So most people think that Peter is writing perhaps early 64, maybe even 63. And so this had to have been before that. Verse 12, by Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. So this is also in the last chapter of 1 Peter. And so Silvanus, or Silas, he transcribed the words. And so Silas was with Peter. And it's even possible that he delivered the letter, sort of how Paul would have like Tychicus write and deliver letters. The words would be dictated by the author, and then another person would write down that dictation. Doesn't mean it's any less inspired. It just means that somebody physically put the words that were inspired on the page. And so Silvanus was with him, which we typically think of him as being with Paul, but he is with Peter at this point. It says, she who is in Babylon is likewise sends greetings to you. And so therefore he's also with Peter. And it doesn't say greet Mark. And so, Mark probably didn't deliver the letter as well. And so Mark, my son, is also with him. And so Mark probably didn't deliver it. Mark is also described as Peter's son here. And so this is John Mark. So Peter probably sees himself as Mark's mentor. And so sort of compare, the relationship between Paul and Timothy. And in fact, many think that Mark's gospel is taken from Peter's account. And so that kind of dovetails in with that. And so Mark was also in Rome at many times. So we can look at like Colossians 4, Philemon, and because of where Paul was at the time of those writings and the mentionings of Mark, it's not a crazy thing to say that all of this is being written from Rome. So any thoughts on the time or the place before we move along? Okay. So we've talked about the person who's writing, the person being written to. We have the time and place of the writing. And so now what's the occasion of the writing? What's the circumstances surrounding this writing? Well, like I kind of briefly alluded to in a second ago, this Great Fire of Rome kind of changed a lot of things, but it also exposes some already existing attitudes that Romans had towards Christianity. And it wasn't a favorable attitude. Underneath the Roman Empire, there were a lot of different religious beliefs and religious practices, all underneath that big umbrella of the Roman Empire. But the Roman take of Christianity was a generally negative one, and the treatment of Christians was a generally negative one. And the fire of Rome kind of gave this excuse to mistreat Christians even more. And that occurred in July of AD 64. And so just after when we believe that 1 Peter was written. And so Romans first, whenever this fire occurred in Rome, and it burned much of the city of Rome. It was a devastating fire. And just as with any kind of disaster, everyone wants someone to blame. And so a lot of the Romans accused Nero of starting the fire. And so Nero needed a way out. And Tacitus, which is this Roman historian, he writes about this event in a book that he calls Annals, like a history of Rome. And this man, Tacitus, he has no stake in the game for Christianity. He's not defending Christianity. He is a Roman citizen, born in AD 56. And so he would have been about 8 years old when this fire occurred. So he would have known about it. This Tacitus was a Roman senator and a historian. And so he would have been around when this stuff was happening. So we can have a little bit of confidence in what he's going to say about this. And what I want to bring out here is the attitudes that he would have had towards Christian people. And this is a Roman person, a Roman senator, writing about Christians. And so we have this fire of Rome. Nero wants to get it off of himself. People are accusing him, so he needs a scapegoat. And so this is what Tacitus writes about the situation. Such indeed were the precautions of human wisdom, this idea of blaming somebody. And so the next thing was to seek means of propitiating the gods. So, the Romans wanted to offer sacrifices to the many gods that they had in order to make appeasement for everything that had happened. They might have seen it as some kind of punishment. But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order by Nero, telling people, I need some more room to build my palace. Burn out a section of the city. So he needed to get this stink off of himself. You can see kind of politics doesn't really ever change, does it? So consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Doesn't sound like Tacitus has a very high value or esteem for this group, the Christians, does he? Thinks very lowly of them. And he continues, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment. A most mischievous superstition. Doesn't sound like a very high praise, does it? Thus checked for the moment. This is something that might break out. It might become this horrible scourge on the empire. But right now, we've got it in check. Again, broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So again, I guess not a high view of all the different things that go on in Rome either. But he doesn't have this high view of Christianity. Going forward, accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Now, I want you to think about that. These are perfectly innocent people. These Christians, I can pretty confidently say they didn't start the fire. But an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. I don't think they pled guilty just out of niceness. They probably had their arms twisted just a little bit in order to do that. And so they were convinced to plead guilty. And so that's what happened to them. This is how people were treated in the Roman Empire. This is how Christians were treated in the Roman Empire. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted. Not so much of the crime of firing the city, of setting the city on fire, as of hatred against mankind. They just didn't like them. The fire was just an excuse at this point, and it was just a reason to put these people to trial. And so mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. So it wasn't enough that they just put these people to death, but they were putting them to death all the while mocking these individuals. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished or were nailed to crosses. That's just not a pleasant thing to think about, but this is the way the Roman Empire treated Christians. Nailed to crosses or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. That's not a pretty picture at all. Hanging these people on crosses, which I know I've said this in the past, but the cross as a form of execution was something that the Roman Empire considered so heinous and so bad that you could not put a Roman citizen to death on a cross. That was forbidden. That was cruel and unusual to them. But yet people who were outside of Roman citizenship, you could do it to. And so they reserved this worse, form of execution to these people. These most shameful form of execution, they reserved it for these people. And what Tacitus says here, that there were so many of them that they put them up on these crosses, they put them on fire, and they lit the road with these people. That's a lot to bear as a Christian. And so think of that as some of our environment in which this letter is written. This stuff hadn't happened yet, but those attitudes that led to those occurrences already existed in society. And we'll visit some of that here in just a second, but let's kind of talk a little bit more of this. And so this is a painting. This was done sometime before the 70s AD, because this is on a wall in Pompeii. It's preserved for to this age. And this is depicting a riot in the city of Pompeii. And you can just see all of these people, kind of stick figures almost arguing and such. Here's like a guy robbing a store. Here is a bunch of people kind of beating up on this guy. So this is sort of what a first century riot would have looked like to a first century person. And so this would have had to have been, painted before 79 when Mount Vesuvius erupted and preserved all of this stuff. And so this was a riot over some games that occurred in AD 59. There was some kind of disagreement, and so the city just went into this uproar. And so with that in mind, let's remember what happened in Ephesus. And so the craftsmen in Ephesus were upset because Christianity was ruining their trade. And so we're back in the Bible now, in Acts. And so there arose no little disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These craftsmen he gathered together with the workmen in similar trade and said, "Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger, not only in this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship." And so these Roman citizens, these people in Ephesus, in the province of Asia, they felt threatened by Christianity. And so what did they do at all of this? Well, when they heard this, when the crowd heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And they were just chanting that. So the city was filled with the confusion. Think of that painting we just looked at. The whole city was filled with this confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. I don't think they went and dragged those guys out to pat them on the back and tell them how awesome they were, or calmly and rationally discuss their differences with them. These people were probably being sorely mistreated. They may have even paid with their lives, don't know. And so again, we see the environment in which these early Christians were living in. But it wasn't Romans only, but it's also Jewish attitudes towards Christianity in this era. So Acts 4, "And as they were speaking to the people, and the priests and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them, greatly annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead." Remember, the Sadducees denied any form of resurrection. "And they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening." And so these guys had to spend a night in jail because they dare preach something that they did not agree with. Furthermore, Acts 5, "But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him," that is the party of the Sadducees, "and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in the public prison." Again in Acts, "But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead." And so again, just for preaching something that they didn't agree with, they killed Paul. And think of the kind of things that Paul himself even did earlier in his life. Now we even have Jewish attitudes within Christianity. If you were a regular Bible reader, could you raise your hand? I did not hear that bell at all. "But some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go to Jerusalem and to the apostles and the elders about this question." And so, and we even see how Peter acts, and he acts himself. He in Antioch, he ceases to eat with the Gentile Christians and eats with only the Jewish Christians. Now, so think of all of this, what we just said about the occasion. Think of this kind of life that these Gentile Christians would have lived in the first century. At any point in time, they could have been dragged out of their home. They could have been fired from their jobs. They could have been tortured. They could have been killed. And that's outside of the church. And then, and then you have Jewish people who might even go in and mistreat the church. You have Jewish Christians who might go in and say, "Oh, you Gentile Christians, you aren't even full Christians. You are Christians with a little apostrophe next to your name. And, you have to be Jewish first, or you're a second-class Christian." And you have all of these thoughts and feelings and emotions and events happening to you. What are you probably going to think? Probably what would any of us think? You'd probably think, why do I bother with any of this? what is this worth? Think of if anything like that happened in your life. If your faith here, removed you from your friends, removed you from your job, could get you arrested at any point, what would you do? You might think life would be so much easier if I just set this aside and became just like everybody else. That must have been what these people were thinking. And so what do they need at this point in their walk? They need encouragement. They need words to tell them that this fight in this life, this challenge in this life, this persecution in this life, it's worth it. It is worth putting up with, because what you will benefit from being in God's kingdom in the future is so much more important than anything that you have now. And so that's going to be the crux of this letter, I think. And some of the words and some of the Jewish framing of this, writing to Gentile people, is also reminding them that they are every bit a vital part of this kingdom of God as anybody else from any other background. And so those Jewish words are used to describe them. They are just as much chosen as the Jewish Christians are. And so this letter is primarily encouragement. Any other parting thoughts before we close for today? Yes?
It was just, 8 years later that the Romans ransacked and tore down Jerusalem and the temple?
Yeah, sooner than that, yeah. Yeah, that'd be, if this was written in 64, it'd be about 6 years. But that war would have started just 2 years later. And so don't think of that temple as the beginning of that event. That was the end of a 4-year war. So yeah, that's definitely a big part of this. Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, I do thank you for your attention and your comments today. Lord willing, we will continue next week. I'm going to do the very worst thing that I can do as a teacher. I'm going to leave you with all of this, and I'm going to be gone for the next 2 weeks. But you are in very capable hands. And so I know Richard and Jason are going to fill in for the next 2 weeks, and they are going to do an amazing job. Hopefully, I set the table well for them. So thank you all, and we will see you then.